Hello and welcome to the new series of Drishti IAS. I am Pooja. In this segment, we are going to discuss about the rising trend of unemployment among the youth population. Now, this is not only with respect to India, but around the world, we are seeing a trend, and that is quite worrying. So, on the occasion of International Youth Day, which is celebrated every year on 12th of August, it is important to know what is up with our youth. So let's have a look on the different topics that we are going to cover. From the news to the International Youth Day, because theme can also be asked in your prelims paper, about International Labour Organization, because the report that we are going to discuss is released by International Labour Organization. Also, the highlights of the report, what is the global trend and what does this report say with respect to India? And the recommendations will also be discussed. In conclusion, I will try to summarize everything. And in the last of the segment, we have a prelims-based question. If you are going to answer it, I'm going to take your name in the next segment. So the ILO report says youth employment is deteriorating in India, but the similar cases can also be seen in other countries. But such countries like India are seeing a much more wider challenge with respect to it. Let us move on and talk about International Youth Day. International Youth Day, for the first time ever, was endorsed by the UN General Assembly in 1999. And since then, it is celebrated on 12th of August as International Youth Day, of course. What does it want to do? It wants to acknowledge and appreciate the importance of youth participation in the current affairs and the general economy and socially, culturally, everything, because there are many facets of participation. Theme for 2022 is intergenerational solidarity, creating a world for all ages. That means there should be a commonality despite the fact that age gap is there. So it wants to fight ageism as well. Moving on, if we talk about the current scenario with respect to how many youth are there in the world, 2020 United Nations World Youth Report was released, and in which it was said that 1.21 billion, that is 15.5% of the global population, is the younger population. That means they go between the ages of 15 and 24, 15.5% as per 2020. Moving on, if we talk about the relation of youth population with respect to India. This is also Youth in India 2022 report. Tell me in the comment segment which organization released it. You see, if we talk about the youth in 2021, Bihar stands first, okay, and that pertains to the age, the youth age. And of course, after that we have Himachal Pradesh, then we have Kerala, then we have Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, Tamil Nadu, and then we have Uttar Pradesh. Okay, so you see that in India, as of 2021, 27.2% was there with respect to the entire country, the percentage, and that will increase. But you see a trend, this is what an approximation is. So you see the trend in different states are decreasing, right? So let's move on and talk about the other aspects of today's segment. Now, if we talk about International Labour Organization, it was created in the year 1919 as a part of the Treaty of Versailles, which ensured that World War I comes to an end. And after that, there was an uproar among those classes which wanted that there should be no discrimination on the basis of work, on the basis of, you can say, social segregation. So for that, International Labour Organization came into being. And the ILO moved to Geneva in the summer of 1920. We also should know that in 2019, the International Labour Organization celebrated its 100th day of origin. Albert Thomas was the first director, remember this. Okay, and this picture shows us the constitution of the ILO when it was presented, when it was signed. Who was the main person that we should know about? Samuel Gompers. Okay, so Samuel Gompers, along with other representatives of the country, they ensured that we have a robust constitution of the ILO. Another thing, when International Labour Organization in 1946, it went global. That means it became a specialized agency of the UN. We have to know that who was the director back then as well. So ILO Director General, who was Edward Phelan. Okay, remember that. And Lai, who was the United Nations Secretary General. These kind of questions can also come. Remember that. Moving on, if we talk about UN agency, the perspective of UN agency of the ILO, it is the only tripartite UN agency. That means it brings along three parties together: the government, the employees, and the employers. So that is why it's tripartite. And 187 member countries. The aim is to set labor standards, develop policies, and also devise programs for the betterment of work for all, not only for men, but also women and other genders as well. So if we talk about India's relations with ILO, it's a founding member. Since 1922, India is a permanent member in the governing body, which is the highest executive body of the council of the organization. The first ILO office in India was started in the year 1928. Okay, moving on. Remember that there are certain conventions that India has ratified with respect to its labor standards by the ILO, but there are two which have not been ratified as of yet. If you know the answer, tell me in the comment segment. So the report that we are going to talk about today is Global Employment Trends for Youth 2022, Investing in Transforming Futures for Young People. It has made certain observations that can lead us to better policy making as a country. So in 2019 and 20, we see that those aged between 15 and 24 years experienced a much higher percentage loss in employment than adults. That means this particular group of youth, they tend to not be as employed as the adult generation is between 2019 and 2020. The high number of young people are not in employment, education, or training. That is abbreviated as NEET. Okay, and that has rose to further in 2020. So there is a productivity wastage when most of the population of the youth, they are not in employment, education, and training. So what are they doing? Then 2021, 75 million young people were unemployed, 408 million were in employment, 732 million people were out of the labor force, and the global youth unemployment rate is projected to be 14.9% in the year 2022. Now, this data is important for you to remember. Moving on. Now, the relatively low labor force participation rate of young people is primarily driven by the pursuit of an education. Most of the youth are choosing to pursue their education rather than being in the labor force. Now, this could benefit them in the future. That is fine. But what about the ratio of the population, youth population, which are not in education or training? Then the young workers are twice as likely as adult workers to live in extreme poverty. So the chances of the young population to live in poverty, it has increased twice as much as adults. Okay, and that is with respect to purchasing power parity. The categorization has been done on purchasing power parity terms, which means a person living on less than 1.90 US dollars per day, converted into rupees. And the rise in youth unemployment by around 4 million in 2020 is grossly underestimated, because there are many other people, many other youth population, but which are not in the formal economy. They're in the informal economy, but they have not been recorded. We know that India employs so many people. 80% of the population in India is employed informally. So what about them? That is why it is underestimated. There are also regional differences. Some regions are showing proper data with respect to employment and unemployment. Some are not. There is a difference. In Europe and Central Asia, we can see that the rate is predicted to be 16.4%. But the actual potential shocks of the war in Ukraine are going to likely affect the unemployment, because many people who were employed in Ukraine and even Russia, they will tend to lose jobs because displacement is there, immigration is there. Then gender gap has also been highlighted in this report, in which it says 27.4% of young women were projected to be in work in 2022 compared to whopping 40.3% of young men. So there is a gap. Only 27% of women, young women, versus 40% of men. So representation will also be harmed when a certain amount, when women or any other gender is not represented in any sort of labor force, what happens? Policymakers will not care about them. So policymakers should ensure that more and more participation comes from all the genders, other genders, the weaker genders specifically, so that policy formation can be done. The gap is the largest in the lower middle income countries with respect to it, that is 17.3 percentage points, and smallest in higher income states at 2.3 points. So you see, the smaller states, the lower and middle income states are showing a much larger gender gap as compared to the other ones. Moving on, let's talk about the reasons. First of all is the COVID-19 pandemic, which has displaced a large number of labor, and they have dropped out in such a manner that they are not coming back to the workforce. Another one is inflation. We see inflation is almost reaching at its peak, and if God's grace is there, I can say, because economy is in such a position, only God can save it. We can say that. So inflation is peaking so highly that we tend to just see that because of that, many people are leaving their generic jobs and going back into the agriculture. This is, I'm speaking from the perspective of those countries who are highly agriculturally dependent, who are unable to afford anything in the urban areas, so they are going back into the rural areas. Lack of sustainable choices. Certain times those employment industries which are not economically sustainable and environmentally sustainable, they tend to lose grounds, and that is why unemployment is rising. Structural changes have been made. You see, in the last 2 years, so much structural change has been made in the work, you can say the work structure. Digital economy has boosted so much that there has been, you can say, not want of certain classes of workers, which are now replaced by the digital economy or the mechanized economy. So that is also one of the reasons. Moving on, there was also a positive take in that young people were well placed to benefit from the expansion of the green and blue economies. That means economy which pertains to being environmentally sustainable, cleaner economies, and blue economy, that means the marine economy. So that is getting boosted. With respect to India, it says that there is a declining youth participation. The youth employment participation rate has declined by 0.9 percentage points in the first 9 months of 2021. But we compare it to 2020, it is lower. And it has increased by 2 percentage points for adults. For adults, it has increased. For youth between the age of 15 to 24 has decreased. There is also a digital divide because the schools in the lockdown, school closures lasted for almost 18 months. It can vary in some places, in which there were 24 school-going children, they were impacted. Because everybody is not going to have laptops, internet connection. Specifically, I'm talking for the people, for the children in the rural area. So 8%, only 8% of such children in rural areas and 23% in urban areas had the you can say the affordability. They could afford such things, or if they could afford, there was no digital penetration, so they lost their education abilities, and because of that, their employment opportunities will also get impacted in the future. And there is also learning regression. First of all, learning was lost. Secondly, learning regression is not remembering what you have already studied. So that has happened. 92% of children on average lost at least one foundational ability in language. 82% lost at least one foundational ability in mathematics. So there is learning regression as well. They are going back. Whatever has been achieved in so many years is getting cancelled. Then gender gap. For gender gap in India, it says that there is low youth, female and labor market participation. Young Indian men account for 16% of the entire global market. For Indian women, it is just young Indian women, it is just 5%. So you can see the gap. Moving on, let's talk about other things. That is, there is a lack of robust infrastructure, financial infrastructure in India. How? Because teachers in state-sponsored schools are getting paid better when we compare to another schools. Like teachers in low-fee private schools in India, Kenya, Nigeria, and Pakistan, they are paid between 1/8 to 1/2 of their counterparts in the state sector what the state sector is receiving. And we can see because of that, there is a lack of morale to be in this profession. Also, domestic work is a highly informal sector in which, because of its informality, because it is informal, what happens? First of all, policymakers are not able to get them a proper social security measure like the formal ones get. Secondly, if there is any sort of exploitation that is being done, that is also being overlooked because they are not registered. So informal sector employs about 80% of India's labor force, and it produces 50% of the GDP. Wages are extremely low. Apart from that, there is for young women and girls, they're vulnerable to abuse, all sorts of abuse, emotional, financial, sexual, every sort of abuse. Moving on, let us talk about appreciation has been done for Manrega. It has said that Manrega has played an important role in providing paid employment. So that was in the peak of Corona pandemic between April to October 2020. It provided more than 253 crore person days of work. So people who were migrating from the urban areas to the rural areas, they could at least get some work through Manrega. Then it registered 58% of the increase over the same period in the previous year. So comparatively, 58% is a huge jump. And also it helped in carbon sequestration because the nature of the act itself is like, it provides a lot of support to greener technologies, takes care of the rural areas, trees, ponds, like that. So that is why. What are the recommendations of the report? First of all, there should be a dedicated recovery package. Like for India, we have Atmanirbhar Bharat. These kind of packages could also be dedicated to the young population so that they do not fall behind the adults. Redirecting public investment towards digital, care, and green economy. Digital is, of course, with respect to internet. Green is clean and sustainable economy with respect to environment. Care economy is that economy. Like in our houses, we generally see mothers and sisters lending their hands into the household work. They are caring for the adults, caring for us. So those work which actually are financially productive, but they are not getting the amount that they should receive, that is the care economy. If this is done, then what will happen? There can be a net creation of 139 million additional jobs by 2030, and that will be more than 30 million. For that, more than 30 million would be taken by the young people between the age of 15 to 29. Also, investing in care economy will help a lot. And then labor market and skill development. Skill development is important. Whenever there are structural changes, many structural changes have occurred. Now we are not seeing those conventional sorts of jobs that were there in the market to be the same after the pandemic started. So we see that skill for certain other jobs are also needed. So that can also be done. Supporting youth entrepreneurship, because it is impossible to provide everybody government job. So entrepreneurship with respect to startups and all should also be boosted. Regular monitoring should be also done. Evaluation and fine-tuning, policy making should be done. Trial and error method should be used. What kind of policies are working and what kind of policies are not. Now, let us look at the conclusion. You see, this has been said by the ILO Deputy Director General for Policy. What young people need most is well-functioning labor market. That means there should be creation of supply of labor market. Decent job opportunities should be provided to them through upskilling for those who are already participating in the labor market. Quality education should be done and training opportunity should be given. This is the entire summary. Let us move on to our question, and yes, answer this correctly. Now, I'm going to take the names of those who have answered my last question correctly. Okay, so let's give it a look. Just bear with me a few moments. This question, let me read it out. Which of the following is the only tripartite agency of the UN, that is United Nations? The options have been given. You can answer them in the comment segment. The last analysis of the electricity bill. Here I did not ask any questions. I asked you the question in, I think, footprints one, right? Yeah. So Lord William Bentinck was the correct answer for that. Let me take the names of those who have answered it correctly. I think A was William Bentinck. Yes. Yes, Lord William Bentinck. So Chirasmita Patra has answered it correctly. Praveen, Rahul, Sandeep, R.V. Agrawal, Manish Acharya, Vikash, Akhil, Mukesh, Aman has answered it correctly. Vagabond Utkarsh has answered it correctly. Karthik has not answered it correctly. It's actually William Bentinck, option A. Chitra has answered it correctly. Deepika has answered it correctly. Then Bhavnaba has answered it correctly. Rishikesh, Sharath, then if your name is Western Ghats, you have answered it correctly. IAS Motivation has answered it correctly. Priyanshu has answered it correctly. Aryan, Anjali, Shubham, Aditi, Ramandeep, Basant, Anuj Singh Chauhan has answered it correctly. Vidya, Gunsha has answered it correctly. Sai has answered it correctly. Prashant has answered it correctly. Neeta, Vetri, MD Harish has answered it correctly. Dharmendra has answered it correctly. Anonymous has answered it correctly. Kunal, Krishna, Sudarshana, Pallavi Jangid, Anurag has answered it correctly. Raghav, Balram, Guru Prasad. I cannot read this word. Puite. Be kind. Okay, he or she has answered it correctly, or they have answered it correctly. Rohit has answered it correctly. Himanshu, Sanjana, Sai, then again Priyanshu, Hema, aspirant Khushwant, Diksha has answered it correctly. Chandan has answered it correctly. Aditya, Rajat has answered it correctly. Also Neha and Janvi. Okay, so answer this question as well. I will try to include your name. Okay, thank you so much for watching. We shall meet again with another segment.